Ordinary mornings can disguise the weight of destiny. A plane boarded with laughter, coffee cups, and brief conversations carried far more than passengers. It carried a reckoning that would change how the world remembers courage. The greatest turn in this story hides just out of reach, and when it comes, it leaves no one untouched. Subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments how you feel about the plot so far, and your location as you watch. Ezekiel Carter, a quiet black engineer, boards United Flight 93 to San Francisco. Around him, mostly white passengers chat casually. He notices some cold stares, whispers, and a flight attendant subtly ignoring him while serving others. Ezekiel Carter tightened the strap of his weathered satchel as he stepped into Newark Liberty International Airport, blending into the tide of early morning travelers, yet always standing apart in ways he could never control. He was a 35-year-old systems engineer with a disciplined mind and a thoughtful gaze, but to many strangers, the only thing that seemed to matter was the color of his skin. Today, he carried not only his laptop and presentation notes, but also the quiet hope that the trip to San Francisco might finally secure his reputation at work. His company had been preparing a new project, one that could define careers, and Ezekiel wanted more than anything to be judged for his knowledge, not for the prejudice that so often shadowed him. As he approached the gate, his steps steady and deliberate, he noticed the small signs of exclusion he had grown used to. The man in a pressed gray suit standing ahead of him in line gave him a sidelong glance, then subtly shifted his body as though to widen the space between them. Two college-aged women glanced at his shoes, whispered to each other, and smirked, their eyes dismissing him before he even reached the counter. The gate attendant offered warm greetings to the white passengers before him, but when Ezekiel handed over his identification, her tone cooled, her smile faded, and her words turned mechanical. "Id, please," she said curtly, without once looking him in the eye. Ezekiel passed his license across the counter, his hands steady, his jaw tightening against the familiar sting. When she handed him back his boarding pass without acknowledgement, he still murmured a quiet thank you. It was what he had been taught to do, to show courtesy even when it was not returned. Boarding the aircraft, Ezekiel inhaled the familiar chill of recirculated cabin air. The rows stretched before him, neat and identical, yet to him the atmosphere already carried an edge. He found his assigned window seat midway down the plane and carefully slid his satchel beneath the seat in front of him. Settling into the narrow cushion, he noticed the man who would be seated beside him, a middle-aged traveler with polished shoes and an expensive briefcase. The man nodded without a word, then angled his body slightly toward the aisle, leaving a deliberate gap as though Ezekiel's presence carried something unwanted. Ezekiel turned toward the oval window, focusing instead on the bustle outside. Luggage carts rattled across the tarmac, fuel trucks maneuvered into place, and ground crew guided the aircraft into its queue. Sunlight reflected off the silver bellies of the planes waiting for departure, and Ezekiel whispered a small prayer for strength. He prayed not for safety alone, but for the patience to endure yet another trip marked by subtle cuts of exclusion. The engines hummed alive beneath the cabin, and passengers around him shifted in their seats, preparing for the flight. A flight attendant walked the aisle, her voice cheerful as she handed menus to a row of white passengers ahead of him. When she reached Ezekiel, her tone flattened, her smile disappearing as quickly as it had come. "Anything to drink?" she asked, her eyes already moving past him. He asked for water. She placed the cup on his tray without comment and moved on. Ezekiel took the cup, whispering another thank you, though no one seemed to hear. As announcements filled the cabin, the words were routine, almost soothing. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard United Flight 93 with non-stop service to San Francisco. Please secure your belongings and fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for departure." The calm tone offered the illusion of order, and for a moment, Ezekiel allowed himself to believe in that routine. He opened his wallet and pulled out a photograph of his sister Naomi and her children back in Detroit. Their smiling faces reminded him why he worked long hours, why he shouldered disrespect with quiet endurance, why he refused to allow bitterness to consume him. He had promised Naomi he would call her as soon as he landed, and though he did not know why, he repeated the promise silently to himself, as if holding on to it gave him a tether of reassurance. The plane began to taxi, vibrations rippling through the cabin floor. The man beside him flipped open his briefcase, scribbling notes as though Ezekiel did not exist. A few rows up, Two young men laughed loudly about their weekend plans, their voices filling the aisle. Across the way, a child clutched a stuffed animal, leaning against her mother's arm. Life unfolded in small, ordinary ways, but beneath the surface, Ezekiel could not shake a sense of unease. He reminded himself that every flight began this way, a mixture of anticipation and monotony, and that there was no reason to suspect anything more. Yet years of living as a black man in spaces where he was often unwelcome had trained him to notice the quiet shifts in atmosphere, the way a single glance or muttered word could carry more weight than any turbulence. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing slowly, preparing himself for the hours ahead. The morning light slanted across the cabin windows as United Flight 93 leveled into the open sky, and Ezekiel Carter pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the shrinking patchwork of Newark disappear below. Yet he could not shake the faint discomfort that pressed against his chest, an unease that had little to do with flying and everything to do with the eyes that seemed to follow him. The man beside him shifted again toward the aisle, a gesture so slight that it might have been dismissed as a simple stretch, but Ezekiel knew better. He had lived too long in the rhythm of small exclusions to mistake it for anything else. 2 rows ahead, a pair of young white businessmen glanced back at him, their laughter low and private, and one of them muttered just loud enough for Ezekiel to hear the phrase about cheap shoes, followed by a smirk that carried the sting of ridicule. Ezekiel looked down at his worn brown loafers, the same pair he had polished before leaving his apartment, shoes that had carried him to countless late nights at the office, shoes that had never once betrayed his determination, and yet here they were transformed into a target for mockery. He clenched his jaw, turning back to the window, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of seeing him respond. The flight attendant returned to distribute safety cards and small refreshments, her smile as warm as sunlight when she addressed the row of college students across the aisle. But when she reached Ezekiel, her tone cooled once more, her voice sharp and efficient, as though he were an obstacle rather than a passenger deserving care. He accepted the small pack of pretzels without comment, placing it neatly on his tray, his patience unbroken but fraying quietly inside. Overhead, the intercom crackled with the captain's voice, calm and practiced, apologizing for a slight delay caused by air traffic, assuring the passengers that tailwinds would make up the lost time, and Ezekiel closed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts, trying to remind himself that prejudice was not new, that he had endured it before and would endure it again, and that today would be no different. Yet as the hum of engines steadied and the seatbelt sign blinked off, a deeper ripple began to form, one that had nothing to do with the color of his skin and everything to do with the invisible threat gathering in the air. Somewhere in the cockpit, a radio transmission echoed across frequencies, picked up by Boston Center, a transmission filled with strange words and chilling threats, and though the passengers in the cabin remained oblivious, officials on the ground were already beginning to whisper the word hijacking. Ezekiel leaned back, pulling out the photograph of Naomi and her children once again, letting their smiles ground him, unaware that the day's ordinary discomfort would soon be overshadowed by terror. A man across the aisle pulled out a cell phone, speaking into it with irritation about delayed meetings, and Ezekiel caught fragments of his words, noticing how he casually leaned away from Ezekiel, as though sharing the same air might somehow stain his suit. Ezekiel swallowed his frustration, reminding himself that he was here for a purpose, that his job presentation in San Francisco mattered, that enduring these endless slights was part of what it meant to carve a space in a world that resisted him. He glanced again at the businessmen 2 rows up, now laughing over a magazine, their voices too loud, their eyes flicking back toward him with derision that simmered like a hidden fire. It was not the first time Ezekiel had been made into a spectacle, but in this enclosed cabin, the weight of being othered pressed harder, making him long for the grounding solidity of Naomi's voice, for the comfort of knowing someone believed in him unconditionally. At that very moment, far away, other flights were being overtaken by men with knives and threats of bombs, but in this cabin the insults and cold stares kept Ezekiel pinned to a separate struggle, the fight to preserve dignity when stripped of it by strangers. He shifted slightly, folding his arms, and whispered to himself that he would not let them break his spirit, that the whispers and the glances would not define him, that he was more than the sum of their prejudice. The intercom beeped again, announcing that beverage service would begin shortly, and passengers adjusted their trays, preparing for the simple rituals of flight, rituals that gave the illusion of normalcy. The engines droned steadily as United Flight 93 cut through the morning sky, and Ezekiel Carter tried to lose himself in the monotony of clouds drifting past the window, but the unease from the stares and whispers earlier still gnawed at him, making every second feel stretched taut. The businessmen who mocked him before had grown quieter now, their attention fixed on the flight attendants preparing drink service, and the man beside Ezekiel continued leaning toward the aisle as if Ezekiel's very presence demanded distance. He reached into his bag, pulling out a notebook to review his notes for San Francisco, determined to anchor himself in something productive, but before his pen touched paper, a sharp commotion erupted near the front of the cabin. At first it sounded like a scuffle between passengers, a raised voice followed by the quick movement of feet, but then came the unmistakable sound of a man screaming in pain, and in seconds the air filled with panic. A man in a dark jacket lunged into the aisle, his eyes cold and determined, gripping a small blade that gleamed under the cabin lights. Another followed close behind, spraying something acrid that made passengers cough and shield their faces, the sting of mace-burning eyes and throats. Chaos broke the fragile routine, and fear spread like wildfire. Ezekiel froze for an instant, his instincts battling each other, one urging him to shrink into invisibility, the other urging him to rise and act. But his body remained still as he watched passengers scramble in confusion. A flight attendant shrieked as she was shoved aside, and one of the hijackers barked commands in a heavy accent, waving the blade at anyone who dared move. A man near the front tried to stand, demanding answers, and in one brutal motion he was stabbed, his body collapsing against the seat while gasps and sobs filled the air. Ezekiel's heart pounded, his breath ragged, as he gripped the armrest, realizing that whatever fear he carried of prejudice minutes before was now dwarfed by mortal danger. Yet even in this moment, the ugly shadow of suspicion did not leave him. The businessman across the aisle pointed in his direction, his voice trembling as he hissed to another passenger, "Watch him. He's part of this, I know it." Ezekiel's stomach turned, fury and despair colliding. For here he was trapped with knives flashing and lives threatened, and still his skin marked him as guilty in the eyes of those who refused to see truth. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing he was no threat, but the white man's glare did not soften, his fear transforming into accusation. The hijackers forced passengers toward the back, shouting orders, brandishing what they claimed was a bomb. The smell of sweat and fear mingled in the cabin as mothers clutched children, as strangers huddled together in disbelief. Ezekiel was shoved hard by another passenger, told to sit down and stay still, and he felt the dual weight of the terrorist's violence and his fellow passengers' prejudice pressing down, suffocating him. The flight attendants moved in terror, some trying to help the bleeding man, others frozen in shock, but the hijackers struck again, demanding silence, demanding obedience, demanding fear. Ezekiel clenched his fists in his lap, every fiber of his being urging him to resist. Yet he stayed rooted for now, his mind racing with the image of Naomi and her children, reminding him that survival meant patience, even in the face of humiliation. Overhead, the intercom clicked, and one of the hijackers' voices filled the cabin, announcing in broken English that the plane was under their control, that everyone must remain calm, that no one should interfere, or more lives would be taken. Ezekiel looked around at the faces near him, wide-eyed and pale, some streaked with tears, some frozen in shock, and he realized that none of them truly saw him as an ally in this moment. Not yet. Not while fear twisted perception into prejudice. He whispered again to himself, steadying his breath, telling himself he would endure this moment as he had endured others, but deep down, he knew the stakes had risen beyond anything he had ever imagined. The shouts continued, the aisle filling with the sound of passengers being herded back, and the once routine flight had transformed into a prison in the sky. Ezekiel's heart hammered, not only with terror of death, but with the bitter knowledge that even here, with blades inches away and bombs threatened, he remained trapped under the weight of being seen as other. Yet within that pain, a seed of resolve began to grow, a recognition that survival would demand more than patience, that perhaps one day, maybe soon, he would have to act not only to defend himself, but to prove, to the hijackers and to those who doubted him, that his life was worth just as much as any other on that plane. The cabin still shook with the echoes of panic from the hijackers' strike as passengers huddled in silence, some weeping quietly, some staring blankly forward, while others whispered frantic prayers under their breath, and Ezekiel Carter sat pressed against the window, his hands gripping the armrest until his knuckles burned, his mind struggling to process how quickly ordinary life had been torn apart. Only minutes ago, he had been the subject of ridicule over his shoes and skin, but now the plane was a cage in the sky, controlled by men who claimed to carry a bomb, and every soul aboard was suspended between hope and doom. Yet as fear thickened, fragments of information began to drift from the outside world, carried by cell phones that still found a signal, and voices trembling through connections to loved ones on the ground. A woman across the aisle pressed her phone to her ear, her face draining of color as she whispered, "Oh my God, 2 planes have already hit the towers in New York," and though her words were not shouted, they spread like a current down the rows, the realization washing over the cabin in heavy silence. Another man shouted back to the others, his voice cracking, "The Pentagon's been hit too," and gasps rippled through the passengers as the enormity of the truth began to set in. This was no simple hijacking meant for ransom or negotiation. This was part of a coordinated slaughter, and the plane they sat on was not meant to land safely but to be turned into a weapon. Ezekiel felt his chest tighten as he absorbed the revelation, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might crack his ribs, yet what struck him almost as deeply was the way eyes darted toward him again, suspicion not entirely erased even in the face of such staggering horror. He saw a woman clutch her child closer when he shifted in his seat, as if the skin he had been born with still marked him as somehow tied to the chaos unfolding. He wanted to scream, to tell them he was as much a victim as any of them, that the knives had been pointed at him too, but the weight of a lifetime of judgment held him in place, silent for now, though inside a storm brewed. The hijackers barked again for everyone to remain calm, waving their blades and pointing toward the cockpit, and the passengers lowered their eyes, cowed by fear but simmering with questions they dared not speak aloud. Ezekiel glanced toward the bleeding man slumped against a row of seats, his blood staining the carpet, the metallic scent filling the recycled air, and he thought of Naomi, thought of how he had promised to call her when he landed, and a sharp grief cut through him at the possibility that he might never hear her voice again. Yet beyond his personal sorrow, he felt a deeper dread, the realization that if what the passengers whispered was true, their plane might soon carve destruction into another city, another building filled with people who had no idea that death approached. A young woman seated nearby clutched her phone, her knuckles pale as she spoke to someone on the other end, saying, "They're turning planes into bombs. Don't you understand? This isn't about money. This is about killing everyone." And her sobs filled the silence when the line went dead. Ezekiel closed his eyes, pressing the photograph of Naomi and her children against his chest beneath his shirt, whispering to himself that he would not surrender to despair, not yet, because if the truth from the ground was that they were doomed to die, then perhaps there was still a chance to decide how. Around him, murmurs swelled as passengers pieced together fragments of news, each new confirmation, a dagger of fear, but also a spark of realization, and Ezekiel noticed Clara Hughes, the young woman who earlier had defended him against harsh whispers, her face pale but her eyes sharp, whispering fiercely to the man beside her that they could not just sit and wait, that if the others could not see it yet, she did, that they had to think of a way to resist. Ezekiel felt her eyes flick toward him, not with suspicion but with recognition, as though she knew he too carried the weight of being pushed aside and might understand that survival would not come from silence. For the first time since the hijackers stormed the plane, Ezekiel felt a flicker of connection, fragile but real, a reminder that not everyone would reduce him to skin color when death circled so near. Still, the cabin was divided between those paralyzed by terror and those beginning to whisper of action, and Ezekiel knew that bridging that divide would take more courage than anything he had faced before. The realization that their plane was part of a coordinated suicide mission hung like a suffocating cloud over the passengers of United Flight 93, and Ezekiel Carter felt its weight pressing harder with every whispered confirmation, every sob that broke through the tense silence, every nervous glance cast toward the cockpit where the hijackers barked orders and brandished their weapons. And though the truth had broken through the denial, the cabin was now filled with a mixture of shock and despair that cut through the recycled air like static. People began fumbling with cell phones, desperate to connect with the world below, their trembling fingers pressing buttons as if lifelines could be woven out of numbers and voices. A woman across from Ezekiel clutched her phone so tightly that her knuckles whitened, And when the call finally went through, her voice cracked as she told her husband that she loved him, that she might not come home, and Ezekiel could see the way her shoulders shook as she tried to stay composed for the sake of whoever listened on the other end. Another passenger spoke in hushed urgency to what sounded like a police dispatcher, explaining that the hijackers had knives, that they claimed to have a bomb, that a man had already been stabbed, and that everyone was being forced to the back, his words tumbling over themselves with fear. Ezekiel reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone, his hands shaking despite his effort to remain steady, and he dialed Naomi's number in Detroit, his heart racing as he listened to the ring, praying she would answer. When her voice came through, warm and alive, he felt a surge of relief that nearly broke him, and he whispered her name like a prayer. "Naomi, it's me, I'm on a plane, it's been hijacked," he said quickly, trying to keep his voice steady, but she immediately interrupted with panic, asking if he was safe, if he had been hurt, if he could get off. Ezekiel closed his eyes, his throat tight, and told her no, that he was still alive, but that things were bad, very bad, and he wanted her to know he loved her, that he had always loved her, and that if he did not come home, she had to tell the kids that their uncle had thought of them until the very end. Naomi's voice cracked as she begged him not to speak that way, but Ezekiel knew she could hear the truth in his tone, that she could sense the finality even if she refused to accept it, and he felt his chest ache with the knowledge that this might be their last conversation. Around him, the cabin became a patchwork of final words, each passenger grasping at connection while there was still time. A man seated near the aisle, his face pale, whispered into his phone, "Tell my wife I love her. Tell my kids I'm proud of them," over and over, as though repetition might carry his love further, louder, stronger than the walls of the plane could contain. Clara Hughes, the young woman who had defended Ezekiel earlier, pressed her phone against her cheek and spoke quietly but firmly, her voice steady as she told someone on the ground what was happening, that the hijackers were Middle Eastern, that they claimed to have a bomb, that she did not know if they would survive, and her words carried both fear and defiance, as though she refused to surrender her dignity even now. Ezekiel turned his gaze toward her, finding a strange comfort in her steadiness, a reminder that not everyone around him would cling to prejudice in the face of death, that some still saw him as a man, as a fellow passenger, as a life worth saving. Yet even as he found this comfort, his ears caught another conversation that cut deep. The businessman who had accused him earlier spoke urgently into his phone, saying, "There's a black guy here who looks suspicious. I think he's involved with them." His words soaked in fear and ignorance, and Ezekiel's stomach clenched with anger, his hands curling into fists. He wanted to shout, to tell the man that his blood was the same, his fear was the same, his life was worth just as much, but the futility of fighting prejudice in such a moment hollowed him out, leaving only the bitter sting of injustice layered over the terror of their shared fate. He pulled the photo of Naomi and her children from his pocket, pressing it against his chest as he spoke into the phone again, telling Naomi to stay strong, to remember him not for this final flight but for the years they had shared, for the laughter, for the sacrifices, for the small victories that had defined their bond. She wept openly now, her words breaking, but she told him she would carry his name. She would tell the children his story. She would make sure the world remembered him not as a victim, but as a man who had fought through life's weight with dignity. Ezekiel swallowed hard, his eyes burning, and he told her goodbye, forcing the word past his lips, though every part of him resisted letting go, and when the call ended, he sat in silence, staring at the dark screen, feeling as though a part of him had already slipped into eternity. The cabin was quieter now, not with calm, but with the heavy silence of people who had spoken their last words to those they loved, the air saturated with the weight of goodbyes that lingered like smoke, and Ezekiel Carter sat slumped in his seat, his phone cold in his hand, the echo of Naomi's sobs still pressing against his ears, his heart aching with the knowledge that their connection might have been their last. Around him, some passengers still clutched their devices, whispering into deadlines or staring blankly at dark screens, while others sat frozen in shock, their eyes wide and vacant, as though their souls had already begun to drift beyond the steel walls of the plane. Yet beneath that stillness, a current of murmured conversation began to stir, hushed but urgent, carried from one seat to another like sparks catching across dry brush. and Ezekiel leaned forward to catch fragments of the words that would alter the course of their collective fate. A man near the center of the cabin whispered, "They're not taking us anywhere safe, they're going to crash us," his voice trembling but steady enough to carry truth. And a woman across the aisle answered, "They hit the towers, they hit the Pentagon. This plane is next," her eyes glistening with tears but fierce with clarity. The realization swept through the passengers, each confirmation a nail sealing the coffin of denial, and Ezekiel felt the same dread harden into his bones. This was not a hijacking for ransom, not a hostage situation where time could buy survival. This was a suicide mission, and the only outcomes were fire and death. He looked down at his hands, strong hands that had built engines, repaired systems, held the hands of his nieces when they were frightened, and he felt a surge of fury that those hands, his life, his dignity, could be erased in the cruelty of men who saw human beings only as weapons. Clara Hughes turned in her seat, her face pale but determined, her eyes sweeping across the small cluster of passengers nearby, and she spoke low but firm, "We can't just sit here. If they're going to kill us anyway, then we have to fight." Her words cut through the heavy silence, and for the first time Ezekiel saw several heads turn in agreement rather than fear. But almost immediately another voice snapped back, a man in his 40s with graying hair. "We don't need everyone, and we sure don't need him." His eyes landing directly on Ezekiel, dripping with prejudice even as death loomed only minutes away. The sting was sharper than any knife, and Ezekiel's stomach tightened with the familiar burn of rage. But before he could respond, Clara's voice rose with sharp defiance. "That's enough. We need every single person if we're going to have a chance. Stop looking at his skin and start looking at the men with the knives." Her words silenced the man, though his glare did not fade, and for the first time Ezekiel felt something shift, the faintest crack in the wall that had always separated him from the rest. He leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "She's right. I'm here, I'm ready, and I won't sit back while they turn this plane into a bomb." Several passengers nodded, some reluctantly, some with quiet conviction, and Ezekiel felt the first spark of unity in a cabin that had been fractured not just by terror, but by suspicion and prejudice. Still, the hijackers patrolled the aisle, their voices barking orders, their hands gripping their blades, their eyes scanning for signs of defiance, and the passengers lowered their gazes again, waiting for the moment to come. Ezekiel's mind raced as he weighed the risk, understanding that if they did nothing they would die as victims, but if they acted, they might die fighting, perhaps buying enough chaos to keep the plane from reaching its target. The thought of Naomi and her children returned to him, their faces glowing with innocence in the photograph still tucked inside his shirt, and he knew in his heart that if he had to die, he would rather die with purpose than vanish into silence. Clara leaned closer, whispering fiercely, "We'll need to rush them. We'll need to use the carts, the boiling water, anything we can." And Ezekiel nodded, feeling his chest tighten with both fear and resolve. The businessman who had accused him earlier muttered under his breath, but this time no one joined him, the gravity of their collective fate overshadowing even his prejudice, though Ezekiel could still feel the weight of his suspicion pressing like a shadow at the edge of his vision. Slowly, passengers began to whisper among themselves, forming an unspoken plan, their fear transforming into determination, their paralysis into movement. And Ezekiel realized that the shattering realization of their doomed fate had also unlocked a possibility that had not existed minutes earlier, the chance to resist. He straightened in his seat, his body trembling with adrenaline, and whispered to himself that his life would not end as a footnote, that his courage would not be erased, that even if the world ignored his name, Naomi would know, her children would know, that he had stood up when it mattered most. The whispers had turned into something sharper now, no longer just the scattered fragments of despair, but the forming outline of a decision that would change everything. And Ezekiel Carter could feel the energy shifting in the cabin as more passengers leaned forward, eyes locking with one another, voices lowering into serious tones, as if they understood time itself was running out. Clara Hughes leaned across the narrow aisle, her jaw tight, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "We need to decide now before it's too late," and the men and women around her nodded, some with fear still etched across their faces, some with the grim steel of acceptance. Ezekiel's heart pounded as he listened, knowing that every word carried the weight of life and death, not just for those inside the plane but for countless others who might be the next victims if they did nothing. A man in the row behind them, heavy-set and middle-aged, whispered that he had spoken with his wife before the line cut out, that she told him the towers had already collapsed, that thousands were dead, and that their plane was surely heading for Washington to finish what the others had started. And at his words, a wave of shock rippled through the passengers, some gasping, some shaking their heads as if denial could somehow pull the truth back. Ezekiel clenched his fists, feeling the burn of anger under his skin, anger at the hijackers, anger at the injustice of his life, anger that even in this moment some had looked at him as a threat instead of a fellow human. And he knew the fury could either eat him alive or become the fire he needed to act. Clara raised her voice slightly, her words cutting through the fog. "We have two choices. Sit here and wait to die, or stand up and fight. Even if we don't make it, we might stop them from killing thousands more," and her eyes swept the rows, daring anyone to challenge her resolve. Some passengers nodded, murmuring agreement, and then one of the younger men, Mark Bingham, spoke up, his voice shaking but strong, saying, "We need to take a vote. Every person deserves to choose, because this isn't just about fighting, it's about how we want to meet the end." The idea spread quickly, heads turning, whispers colliding, until even the quietest passengers were drawn into the gravity of the moment. Ezekiel sat upright, his chest tight, his breath shallow, as he watched hands begin to rise, some tentative, some thrust into the air with conviction, each one signaling a willingness to fight. His hand trembled as he lifted it, the image of Naomi and her children flashing across his mind, their lives tethered to his choice, and though part of him feared dying in a struggle that might fail, he knew that raising his hand was the only way to honor himself, his family, and the truth that his life had meaning. He looked around, saw nearly every hand raised, even those who had doubted him earlier. Though he caught the cold eyes of the businessman who had branded him suspicious, the man's hand raised reluctantly, as though coerced by the weight of unity rather than conviction, and Ezekiel understood that prejudice did not vanish in the face of disaster, it merely bent to necessity. Still, the vote was nearly unanimous, and for the first time since the hijackers had seized the plane, a pulse of hope throbbed in the cabin, fragile but real. Clara nodded firmly, her face set with determination, and she whispered, "Then it's settled. We fight." The words carried like a spark across the rows, igniting murmurs of strategy, talk of boiling water from the galley, of using meal carts as battering rams, of breaking bottles to wield as makeshift weapons, of rushing the cockpit even if it meant tearing their own bodies apart in the process. Ezekiel leaned forward, offering his voice to the plan, suggesting they spread out when they charged so the hijackers could not block them all at once, and for a moment, Clara's eyes met his, acknowledging his presence as not just another passenger, but as someone who belonged at the heart of the fight. Todd Beamer, seated a few rows up, bowed his head and led those nearby in prayer, his voice calm, his words steady, and soon the Lord's Prayer rippled through the cabin, whispered by lips trembling not just with fear, but with faith. And Ezekiel whispered the words too, though his faith had always been more in endurance than in doctrine, yet the rhythm of voices gave him strength, binding him to these strangers in a unity he had rarely felt in life. When the prayer ended, Todd's voice rose, quiet but resolute. "Are you ready?" And though it was not shouted, though it was not theatrical, it carried through the cabin with the force of history, and then he said the words that would echo forever, "Let's roll." A surge of adrenaline raced through Ezekiel's veins, his body trembling with both terror and power, his heart pounding as he realized the choice had been made, that they were no longer passengers waiting for doom, but fighters preparing to seize their fate. He looked once more at the photograph tucked inside his shirt, whispering a silent promise to Naomi that he would make his life count, that he would not go quietly, that he would rise even when the world tried to push him down. The moment of decision had passed, and the whispers of planning had hardened into the steel of resolve, and as United Flight 93 cut through the sky, its cabin was no longer merely a space of terror, but a waiting battlefield where ordinary people prepared to meet extraordinary violence with nothing but courage, desperation, and makeshift weapons. And Ezekiel Carter felt his chest thrum with the rhythm of a heart that knew the end was near but refused to bow without a fight. Clara Hughes leaned toward him, her voice sharp and urgent. reminding him that when the moment came they would need to move fast, to strike together, to overwhelm with sheer force and numbers. And Ezekiel nodded, his body trembling but his eyes steady, knowing that though the fear of dying clawed at his throat, the greater fear was of doing nothing and letting others die because he had stayed silent. Todd Beamer stood a few rows up, his voice low but carrying, reminding everyone again to hold their ground until the signal, and Ezekiel glanced down at his hands, flexing them slowly, feeling the sweat pooling in his palms, reminding himself that these hands had carried tools, fixed engines, cradled children, and that now they would be called to fight. The hijackers patrolled the aisle, their eyes sharp, their blades flashing in the dull cabin light, their voices barking commands to stay down, and Ezekiel lowered his gaze, hiding the storm of determination behind a mask of obedience, waiting for the shift that would turn fear into action. At the galley, a passenger quietly poured boiling water into cups, her hands shaking but her resolve unwavering, and another snapped plastic cutlery against the armrest until the jagged edge resembled something like a weapon, while two men quietly positioned the food cart so it could be shoved forward as a ram. Ezekiel breathed slowly, hearing Naomi's voice in his mind, the echo of her sobs when he told her goodbye, and he promised her silently that he would not let those hijackers turn him into nothing more than a victim, that he would leave this life with his dignity intact, that his nieces and nephews would grow up knowing their uncle had stood tall. Then it happened. One of the hijackers turned his back, distracted by shouts near the rear, and Clara hissed, "Now!" and the passengers surged. The cart was shoved forward with all the force they could muster, slamming into the legs of a hijacker who toppled backward with a cry, his blade clattering to the floor, and the cabin exploded into chaos. Ezekiel leapt from his seat, his body propelled by adrenaline, his hand closing around the hijacker's wrist as he tried to rise, and with a roar, he slammed the man against the armrest, his muscles straining as he held him down. Another passenger poured boiling water onto the second hijacker's face, his screams piercing the cabin, and fists, arms, legs, everything human and desperate crashed together in a storm of violence. The businessman who had doubted Ezekiel earlier stood frozen at first, his eyes wide. But when Ezekiel snarled for help, he finally lunged forward, grabbing the hijacker's arm, though his fear still tainted his movements. Ezekiel bore the weight of the man's resistance, his chest heaving as he pressed his shoulder into the fight, blood spilling from a shallow slash across his arm where the blade had grazed him, but he refused to let go, refused to yield, his fury blazing hotter than the pain. Clara grabbed the fallen blade and struck at the hijacker's arm, forcing him to release his grip, and together they dragged him to the floor, pinning him beneath knees and fists. The third hijacker screamed from the cockpit, the door rattling as he tried to hold it shut, and passengers surged toward it, pounding with fists, with the food cart, with anything they could grasp, the sound of impact shaking the narrow corridor. Ezekiel stumbled forward, blood running down his sleeve, his breath ragged, but he pushed against the crowd, adding his weight to the force battering the cockpit door, his shoulders slamming again and again, until he felt the wood and metal groan beneath the relentless assault. The hijackers shouted inside, their voices frantic, and the plane lurched suddenly, the nose dipping violently as if the pilot inside was trying to throw them off balance, and passengers screamed as bodies slammed against seats, against the floor, but still they surged, still they pushed, still they fought. Ezekiel fell hard, his head slamming against the armrest, his vision flashing white, but Clara's hand grabbed his arm, dragging him up, shouting into his ear, "Don't stop! Don't you dare stop!" And with a roar he rose again, his body battered but unbroken. The businessman who had once accused him of suspicion locked eyes with him for the first time without hatred, his face streaked with fear but also recognition, and together they shoved with the others, their combined weight hammering at the cockpit as the plane jerked and shuddered. Blood, sweat, tears, and fury filled the air, the sound of fists and bodies slamming against steel blending with the wails of children and the screams of men, and Ezekiel felt his strength ebbing but forced it back, calling on every ounce of endurance he had forged in years of being dismissed, ignored, underestimated, and he shouted from the depths of his soul, "We are not nothing, we are not your weapons, we are not your victims," his voice carrying over the chaos like a war cry. In that moment, the passengers saw him not as the black man whispered about earlier, not as the outsider blamed in fear, but as the heart of their resistance, his voice igniting theirs, their cries rising together in a storm of defiance as they battered the cockpit door with the last strength of their lives. The cabin of United Flight 93 had become a storm of screams, shouts, and pounding fists, the narrow aisle no longer a place of quiet obedience, but a battlefield where passengers, fueled by desperation and courage, hurled themselves against the hijacker's control, and Ezekiel Carter felt every nerve in his body burning as he pressed his shoulder once more into the cockpit door, the steel groaning under the relentless force of dozens of human bodies determined not to go quietly. The hijackers inside shouted in panic, their voices sharp with fear as they tried to hold the door shut, and the plane pitched violently, banking hard to one side, throwing people across the cabin, slamming bodies against armrests and overhead compartments. But even as blood-streaked foreheads and tears spilled, no one retreated, no one gave up, because they all knew what awaited if they stopped fighting. Ezekiel's arm throbbed from the deep slash he had taken in the earlier struggle, warm blood soaking into the sleeve of his shirt, but he barely noticed the pain, his entire being focused on pushing, on battering, on fighting forward, because his life and the lives of countless others on the ground depended on it. Clara Hughes was beside him, her face smeared with sweat and tears but her jaw set with ferocity as she slammed the edge of the food cart into the cockpit again and again, shouting for others to help, and the sound of metal against metal rang out like the tolling of a desperate bell. Todd Beamer's voice rose above the chaos, urging them onward, reminding them to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep believing that they could make a difference even if the cost was their lives. Ezekiel drew strength from that voice, but even more from the vision of Naomi and her children in his mind, their faces shining with love, and he whispered under his breath that he would not fail them, not now, not ever, even as the plane itself seemed to resist, shuddering violently as if trying to shake off their defiance. The hijacker at the controls pulled the plane downward, the nose dipping hard, and the cabin filled with cries as gravity shifted, bodies tumbling toward the front, the force pressing them against the door they were trying to break, and Ezekiel seized the moment, ramming his shoulder again and again until the hinge screamed under the strain. Another passenger smashed a fire extinguisher against the lock, sparks flying, and for an instant Ezekiel thought the door might give way, that they might seize the controls, that they might wrest back their fate. But then the plane tilted again, diving steeply, the engines roaring like thunder as the altimeter plummeted, and Ezekiel knew with chilling certainty that they were out of time. The hijackers had chosen to end it, to drive the plane into the earth rather than lose control to those who refused to submit. Ezekiel's breath tore from his lungs, his chest heaving with both exhaustion and defiance as he shouted into the chaos, "Don't stop! Don't stop! We fight until the end." And for the first time, he saw no doubt in the eyes around him, only shared determination, only the fire of human beings who refused to let fear define their final moments. The businessman who had once accused him locked eyes with him again, but this time there was no suspicion, no hatred, only a grim recognition, and together they pushed shoulder to shoulder against the door, their voices merging with the shouts of dozens more, as they hurled themselves at the last barrier between them and destiny. The plane roared downward, the windows rattling violently, the world outside a blur of green and brown as the ground rose fast to meet them, and Ezekiel felt his body torn between terror and serenity, his mind flashing through the faces of his family, the laughter of childhood, the struggles of adulthood, the countless moments when he had been forced to swallow anger and endure, and now the single moment when endurance had transformed into resistance. Clara's hand grabbed his arm, gripping hard, and she shouted something he could not hear over the roar, but he saw her lips form the words, "Thank you," and he nodded, his eyes burning as he pressed forward once more, giving everything he had to the final push. The cockpit door bent under their weight but did not break, and Ezekiel understood that whether they burst through or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had stood, that they had risen, that they had proven themselves human beings capable of defiance, of courage, of unity in the face of annihilation. His body was thrown forward as the plane tilted steeper, gravity crushing him against the floor, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of light, his breath torn from his chest, but still his fists hammered against the steel, still his shoulders slammed forward, still his voice rose in a cry that was both rage and prayer. He thought of Naomi one last time, thought of her children, thought of the candle she would light for him, and he whispered in his heart that he loved them, that he had done everything he could, that he had not let the world erase him. Then the field of Pennsylvania rushed up beneath them. The roar of the engines reached a deafening crescendo, the cabin filled with a final chorus of shouts, cries, and prayers, and Ezekiel felt the violent lurch of impact before everything dissolved into silence, into fire, into history. The earth had trembled when United Flight 93 slammed into the field in Pennsylvania, a violent shudder that split the air and carved a scar into the soil. And in that instant, every voice inside, every shout, every prayer, every cry of defiance dissolved into silence. But the echoes of what they had done did not vanish, for courage leaves an imprint deeper than wreckage, and sacrifice leaves a legacy louder than death. Rescue teams rushed toward the plume of smoke that twisted against the morning sky, their boots sinking into soft ground as they searched through twisted metal and shattered earth. Yet what they found was not simply wreckage, but the fragments of a story that would ripple far beyond the boundaries of that field. The news broke quickly, spreading across radios and televisions, filling living rooms and offices with the stunned announcement that a fourth plane had gone down, and while officials spoke in measured tones of heroism, of passengers who had fought back, the details were drowned in the larger tide of tragedy from the towers and the Pentagon, leaving some names to be praised and others to be forgotten. Ezekiel Carter's name did not rise to the surface of headlines or press conferences, for in the frenzy of storytelling the media favored familiar faces, familiar names, and the majority that reflected the public more comfortably. And though his blood had soaked the floor of that cabin, though his fists had pounded against the cockpit door, though his roar had carried the cry of defiance as strong as any other, he remained in the shadows, his story known only in fragments, his role remembered by few. In Detroit, Naomi clutched the phone long after the line had gone dead, staring at the silent device as if it might bring her brother back. And when the news confirmed that Flight 93 had crashed, she fell to her knees, her cries breaking through the walls of her home, her children clinging to her as she whispered again and again that their uncle had been brave, that he had fought, that he had died not as a victim but as a man who stood when others wanted him to kneel. Days later, when the official accounts began to emerge, when newspapers ran stories of ordinary Americans who had fought back, Naomi searched for Ezekiel's name, scanned every article, every list, but she found it only in the smallest corners, barely mentioned, never highlighted, and the wound of invisibility cut as deep as the wound of loss, yet she refused to let the world erase him. She gathered her children and told them the truth, told them of the call he made, of the promise he gave, of the strength he carried into his final moments, and she lit a candle in the window, swearing that as long as her bloodline lived, his name would be spoken, his courage honored. Across the nation, monuments would be built, speeches delivered, names carved into stone, and though Ezekiel's name might be passed over by some, it remained etched into the memory of those who had fought beside him, into the conscience of those who had seen him rise when they doubted him, into the spirit of his family who knew the truth of his heart. Clara Hughes, who had fought shoulder to shoulder with him, later told investigators that without his strength, they would never have made it to the cockpit, that his cry had been the spark that united them in the final push. And though her testimony was tucked deep within reports, her words carried a weight that truth cannot hide forever. The businessman who had once accused him sat before cameras weeks later, his face pale, his voice trembling as he admitted that he had been wrong, that he had let fear and prejudice blind him, until Ezekiel's courage had shown him the truth. And though he could never undo the shame of his suspicion, he swore that he would never again judge a man by skin before soul. In the end, Ezekiel's legacy lived not in headlines but in the quiet places where truth is carried, in Naomi's living room where the candle burned, in the whispered stories passed down to children who would never meet him, in the hearts of those who had felt his presence in the cabin and survived long enough to speak of it. The message of his life and death was not simply that passengers had fought back, but that dignity matters even when the world denies it, that courage matters even when it goes unseen, and that humanity matters even when prejudice tries to erase it. The crash had silenced Ezekiel's voice, but it had not silenced the truth that he had lived with strength, that he had died with honor, and that his life proved no man should be measured by suspicion or scorn, but by the depth of his humanity. The field in Pennsylvania grew quiet in the weeks after, grass slowly creeping over the scar, but to those who remembered, to those who told his story, it was hallowed ground, A place where ordinary people had risen, where a black man named Ezekiel Carter had fought with every breath to prove his worth, and where history had been changed not by those who sought to destroy, but by those who refused to surrender. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found meaning in the way it unfolded, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps us keep creating stories that matter. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the plot. What stood out to you most, and which moment struck you the hardest? Share your perspective in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice adds to the conversation, and together we can keep these powerful lessons alive.